In 1952, renowned psychiatrist Dr. Albert Ellis encountered a patient who would forever alter his understanding of human potential. The patient, a brilliant mathematician named Robert, had all the external markers of success: a prestigious university position, published research, a supportive family. Yet he sat in Ellis's office, paralyzed by an invisible force that prevented him from pursuing the work he truly wanted to do. "I know I should apply for the research fellowship," Robert explained, his voice hollow with resignation. "I know logically that I'm qualified, but every time I sit down to write the application, I feel this crushing certainty that it would be pointless, that I'm fundamentally not the kind of person who gets those opportunities." Ellis had heard similar statements from hundreds of patients. But what struck him about Robert's case was how articulate he was about his own imprisonment. He could describe the cage perfectly: its dimensions, its construction, even the psychological mechanisms that kept him locked inside. And yet, he remained trapped. Over the next 3 months, Ellis worked with Robert to identify what he termed irrational beliefs, deeply embedded cognitive patterns that operated like malware in the human psyche, corrupting perfectly rational people's ability to pursue their goals and reach their potential. What Ellis discovered during this period would lay the foundation for what we now call cognitive behavioral therapy, and would reveal something profound about the nature of human limitation. Robert's breakthrough came not when he gained new skills or resources, but when he recognized that his beliefs about himself and the world weren't objective truths. They were stories he had internalized so deeply that they had become invisible, operating below the level of conscious awareness, like a psychological operating system running in the background. "It was like waking up from a dream I didn't know I was having," Robert later wrote to Ellis. "The barriers weren't real. They never had been. I had been living my entire life inside a set of assumptions I never thought to question." But here's what most people don't realize about limiting. They're not just minor inconveniences or occasional negative thoughts. They're sophisticated psychological structures that actively prevent growth, often by making the person believe that not growing is the safest, most rational choice. They don't feel like beliefs at all. They feel like reality itself. If you've ever found yourself knowing what you should do but unable to do it, feeling stuck despite having the resources and opportunities to move forward, or watching others achieve goals you've convinced yourself aren't meant for you, then Robert's story holds the key to understanding the invisible architecture of your own limitations. Perhaps you've noticed that certain patterns repeat in your life: relationship dynamics that feel inevitable, career limitations that seem permanent, personal qualities you've accepted as fixed. Maybe you've tried to change these patterns through willpower, positive thinking, or sheer determination, only to find yourself back where you started. Or perhaps you've experienced that strange sensation of simultaneously wanting something deeply while feeling convinced it's impossible for someone like you. What Ellis discovered in his work with Robert and thousands of similar cases was that there exist specific belief structures, psychological frameworks that masquerade as truth, that actively block human development. These aren't just negative thoughts or low self-esteem. They're comprehensive worldviews that organize perception, interpret experience, and dictate behavior in ways that systematically prevent growth. The people who break free from these beliefs don't just feel better. They access capabilities they never knew they possessed. They make career transitions that previously seemed impossible. They form relationships they'd written off as beyond their reach. They develop skills they'd convinced themselves they lacked the natural talent to acquire. This isn't about positive thinking or self-help platitudes. It's about recognizing that your brain operates according to beliefs you never consciously chose, and that by identifying and dismantling these beliefs, you can fundamentally restructure what feels possible in your life. Belief 1. The Permanence Doctrine. The first dangerous belief operates like a psychological prison that doesn't look like a prison at all. It looks like reality. Those who hold this belief experience their current situation, personality, or capabilities as fixed and unchangeable. It's not that they think change is difficult. They experience their limitations as fundamental truths about who they are. Dr. Carol Dweck's research at Stanford revealed the neurological basis for this belief structure. When people with what she termed a fixed mindset encounter challenges or failures, brain imaging shows increased activity in regions associated with threat detection and decreased activity in areas responsible for learning and adaptation. Their brains literally process growth opportunities as dangers to be avoided rather than challenges to be engaged. What makes this belief particularly insidious is how it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you believe your abilities are fixed, you interpret difficulty as evidence of inadequacy rather than a natural part of the learning process. This interpretation triggers avoidance behaviors. You stop trying, you don't seek feedback, you avoid challenges that might reveal your limitations. These behaviors then prevent the very growth that would disprove the original belief. Consider the case of Jennifer, a marketing professional who believed she was not a creative person. This belief wasn't based on lack of imagination. It was based on a statement a high school art teacher made 20 years earlier. For 2 decades, Jennifer structured her entire career around this belief, taking roles that emphasized analysis over creativity, deferring to others in brainstorming sessions, and experiencing anxiety whenever asked to generate original ideas. The transformation came when Jennifer's company sent her to a workshop on innovative thinking. The facilitator asked participants to describe a belief they held about themselves. When Jennifer shared hers, the facilitator asked a simple question: "How do you know that's true?" Jennifer realized she had never tested the belief. She had simply accepted it as fact and organized her entire professional life around avoiding situations that might challenge it. Over the next 6 months, Jennifer deliberately pursued creative projects. What she discovered wasn't that she had hidden creative genius. It was that creativity, like any skill, develops through practice. The belief that she lacked creativity hadn't been protecting her from failure. It had been preventing her from developing the capability she thought she lacked. The practical application of dismantling this belief involves what researchers call belief testing. Start by identifying one area where you've accepted limitation as permanent. Not, "I'm not good at public speaking," but specifically what you believe. "I'm the kind of person who gets too anxious to speak effectively in front of groups." Then design a small experiment to test whether that belief is actually true, or whether it's a story you've been telling yourself. Document the results objectively. Most people discover that their beliefs about permanent limitation aren't based on repeated testing. They're based on avoiding the very situations that would reveal whether the belief is accurate. But here's where many people stumble. They confuse accepting permanent limitation with being realistic. The next belief we'll examine reveals why this confusion is so dangerous. Belief 2, the Safety Doctrine. The second dangerous belief presents itself as wisdom, a sophisticated understanding of risk and self-protection. Those who hold this belief experience caution not as a choice but as intelligence, interpreting their avoidance of challenges as evidence of mature judgment rather than fear-driven limitation. Dr. Jeffrey Young's research on schema therapy revealed that what appears as healthy caution is often a defensive structure built around an unexamined assumption that the world is fundamentally dangerous and that safety comes from avoiding risk rather than developing capability. Brain studies show that people operating under this belief structure demonstrate heightened amygdala activation in response to neutral situations. Their threat detection systems interpreting ordinary challenges as existential dangers. What makes this belief particularly effective at blocking growth is that it wears the mask of intelligence. The person doesn't feel afraid, they feel smart, cautious, strategic. They've learned from experience that taking risks leads to pain. They pride themselves on being realistic rather than foolishly optimistic. And because this interpretation feels like wisdom, it becomes extremely resistant to change. Take the case of Marcus, a software developer who had spent 15 years in the same mid-level position despite repeatedly being encouraged by mentors to pursue senior roles or start his own company. Marcus had developed an elaborate rationalization for why his caution was justified. The tech industry was volatile. Startups usually failed. Senior positions meant sacrificing work-life balance, and he had financial responsibilities. None of these concerns were irrational in isolation, but Marcus's therapist noticed something revealing. Every opportunity, regardless of its specific characteristics, triggered the same risk assessment process that always concluded the same thing. It was too dangerous. The pattern suggested that Marcus wasn't actually assessing risk. He was using risk assessment as a sophisticated justification for avoiding the anxiety that came with growth. The breakthrough came when Marcus's therapist asked him to articulate what he was keeping himself safe from. Failure, Marcus answered immediately. What would failure mean? The therapist pressed. As Marcus explored this question, he realized his belief wasn't actually about external risks. It was about an internal conviction that if he tried and failed, it would reveal something fundamental and terrible about himself. The Safety Doctrine, Marcus discovered, wasn't protecting him from external danger. It was protecting him from ever having to test whether his deepest fear, that he wasn't actually capable of more, might be true. By never fully trying, he never had to fully fail. But he also never got to discover what he was actually capable of achieving. Dismantling this belief requires distinguishing between genuine risk assessment and anxiety-driven avoidance disguised as wisdom. The test is simple, but are you evaluating specific risks with specific mitigation strategies, or are you finding reasons why any growth-oriented action is too dangerous? If every opportunity triggers the same risk avoidance response regardless of its characteristics, you're not being careful, you're being ruled by an unexamined belief about danger. The practical technique involves what psychologists call graduated exposure, deliberately taking calculated risks in low-stakes situations to build evidence that growth doesn't equal destruction. Start with a risk so small that failure would be genuinely inconsequential, and document both the outcome and your emotional response. Most people discover that their sense of danger is massively disproportionate to actual risk. But even those who successfully challenge the first two beliefs often encounter a third structure that's even more subtle and powerful. Belief 3, the Worthiness Doctrine. The third dangerous belief operates at a deeper level than the first two. It doesn't just limit what you think you can do or should risk, it limits what you believe you deserve. Those who hold this belief might intellectually understand that opportunities are available, but they experience a visceral sense that those opportunities aren't meant for people like them. Dr. Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion revealed that this belief structure often originates in early experiences where love or approval was conditional on performance or behavior. The child internalizes the message that their worth must be earned and maintained through achievement, compliance, or meeting others' needs. This creates what psychologists call contingent self-worth, a deep conviction that you only deserve good things when you've proven yourself sufficiently worthy. The neurological impact is profound. Brain imaging studies show that people with contingent self-worth demonstrate unusual patterns when receiving positive outcomes. While most people's reward centers activate when they achieve success or receive recognition, those operating under the Worthiness Doctrine show increased activity in anxiety and monitoring regions instead. Their brains literally process success as something to be suspicious of rather than enjoyed, constantly scanning for when the other shoe will drop. Consider the case of Amara, a talented physician who had built a successful private practice. Despite her objective achievements, she consistently underpriced her services, overworked herself to the point of burnout, and experienced intense anxiety whenever patients expressed gratitude or recommended her to others. In therapy, she described feeling like an imposter who had somehow fooled people into thinking she was competent. What emerged through therapy was that Amara's belief wasn't about her actual competence. She knew intellectually that she was skilled. The belief operated at a deeper level. She felt that she didn't intrinsically deserve the success she had achieved. On some level, she expected to be found out, not as incompetent, but as someone who shouldn't have these good things in her life. This belief manifested in subtle self-sabotage. She would schedule so many patients that she couldn't provide the quality care she valued, then use her resulting stress as evidence that she wasn't actually good enough. She would undercharge to the point where her practice barely broke even, then cite her financial struggles as proof she wasn't meant for this level of success. The belief created behaviors that generated the very evidence that reinforced it. The transformation began when Amara's therapist asked her to notice the moment when positive experiences triggered discomfort rather than pleasure. Amara discovered that every time something good happened, a grateful patient, a successful outcome, a moment of pride in her work, she would immediately think of something she had done wrong or should have done better. She was using self-criticism as a way to pay for positive experiences, as if she needed to suffer to deserve good things. Dismantling the Worthiness Doctrine requires separating your inherent worth as a person from your achievements, behaviors, or others' approval. This isn't about building self-esteem through affirmations. It's about recognizing that the premise is flawed. Your worth isn't something you earn or lose. It's something you have by virtue of existing. The practical application involves what researchers call unconditional self-regard practice. Each day, identify 3 positive experiences and notice whether you immediately discount, minimize, or find reasons why they don't count. When you catch yourself engaging in this pattern, consciously practice accepting the positive experience without needing to earn or justify it. What most people discover is that allowing themselves to experience success without self-punishment doesn't make them arrogant or complacent. It makes them more capable of sustainable achievement. But even this insight can be blocked by a 4th belief that's perhaps the most culturally reinforced of all. Belief 4. The Comparison Doctrine. The 4th dangerous belief doesn't present itself as a belief at all. It presents itself as observation. Those who operate under this doctrine experience constant awareness of how they measure up to others, not as neurotic insecurity, but as necessary information about their place in the world. They believe that their value, progress, and success can only be understood in relation to others' achievements. Dr. Leon Festinger's social comparison theory revealed that humans naturally use others as reference points for self-evaluation. But what begins as a neutral information-gathering mechanism becomes pathological when it becomes the primary or only method of self-assessment. Modern neuroscience shows that chronic comparison activates the same brain regions as physical pain, creating a persistent state of threat detection that prevents presence, enjoyment, and genuine self-knowledge. What makes this belief particularly dangerous in the current era is how technology has weaponized comparison. Social media provides unlimited access to others' curated highlight reels, creating a comparison landscape that's both ubiquitous and fundamentally distorted. The brain's comparison mechanism, which evolved for small tribal groups, now has access to billions of potential comparison targets, creating a situation where someone can always find evidence that they're falling behind. Consider the case of David, a writer who had published 2 well-received novels but found himself unable to work on his 3rd. In therapy, he described feeling stuck and uninspired. But as his therapist explored the stuck feeling, what emerged wasn't creative block, it was comparison paralysis. David had fallen into a pattern of spending hours each day on social media, tracking other writers' success announcements, reading reviews of books similar to his, and monitoring sales rankings. Each session left him feeling simultaneously inadequate and resentful. He would sit down to write, but find himself thinking, what's the point? Someone else already wrote a better version of this. Someone else's book will get more attention. I'll never achieve what they've achieved. The insidious aspect was that David genuinely believed this comparison was useful information. He told himself he was staying informed about the industry or understanding the market. But his therapist asked him to track what happened to his creative output on days when he engaged in comparison versus days when he didn't. The data was stark. Comparison days produced 0 words written and significant emotional distress. Non-comparison days produced consistent progress and genuine engagement with his work. What David came to understand was that comparison wasn't giving him useful information, it was preventing him from accessing his own creative capacity. Every moment spent evaluating his work relative to others was a moment not spent actually working. The comparison wasn't making him better, it was making him paralyzed. The comparison doctrine operates on a fundamental confusion, mistaking relative position for absolute value. Your novel doesn't become worse because someone else published a successful book. Your career doesn't become less meaningful because someone else got promoted faster. Your life doesn't become less valuable because someone else has more followers, more money, or more recognition. Dismantling this belief requires developing what researchers call internal reference orientation. Learning to evaluate your progress, worth, and success based on your own values, goals, and growth rather than others' achievements. This doesn't mean ignoring others or never drawing inspiration from peers. It means recognizing when comparison has shifted from occasional inspiration to chronic self-evaluation. The practical technique involves a 30-day comparison fast. Identify your primary comparison triggers, specific social media platforms, industry publications, certain conversations, and deliberately abstain from them. During this period, establish internal metrics for success. Am I growing? Am I aligned with my values? Am I producing work I find meaningful? Most people discover that without constant comparison, they regain not just peace, but productivity. But even those who successfully challenge these first 4 beliefs often encounter a final structure that's perhaps the most difficult to recognize, because it masquerades as realism itself. Belief 5. The Limitation Doctrine. The 5th dangerous belief presents itself not as limitation, but as truth, a clear-eyed acceptance of reality. Those who hold this belief experience their constraints not as beliefs to be examined, but as facts to be acknowledged. They pride themselves on being realistic about what's possible, distinguishing themselves from people who engage in magical thinking or unrealistic expectations. Dr. Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness revealed the mechanism behind this belief structure. When people repeatedly experience situations where their actions don't produce desired outcomes, they can develop a generalized sense that effort itself is futile. But the critical insight from Seligman's work was that this sense of helplessness isn't based on actual inability. It's based on having learned not to try. The belief manifests in phrases that sound like wisdom. That's just how things are. People like me don't get those opportunities. The system doesn't work that way. You have to be realistic about your limitations. Each of these statements might be true in specific contexts, but when they become generalized explanations for why growth isn't possible, they function as sophisticated forms of self-imprisonment. Consider the case of Elena, a talented project manager who had spent a decade watching less experienced colleagues get promoted past her into leadership roles. When her therapist asked why she thought this happened, Elena had a comprehensive explanation involving organizational politics, gender bias, and lack of the right connections. None of these factors were fictional. They were real obstacles that genuinely affected her career. But Elena's therapist noticed something subtle. Whenever they discussed specific actions Elena could take to advance her career, networking, advocating for herself, seeking high-visibility projects, Elena would explain why those actions wouldn't work given the reality of her situation. The obstacles she identified were real, but the way she related to them had become totalizing. She had moved from, "These are challenges I need to navigate," to, "These make advancement impossible for someone in my position." The breakthrough came when Elena's therapist asked her to identify one person in a similar situation who had successfully advanced. Elena could immediately name several. So how did they do it, given these supposedly insurmountable obstacles? The therapist asked. Elena started to explain how those people were different, more connected, more aggressive, luckier. But mid-sentence, she stopped. "I'm doing it again," she said quietly. I'm explaining why it's impossible for me while acknowledging it's possible for others. That doesn't make any sense. What Elena recognized was that her realistic assessment of her situation had become a form of protection, not from external obstacles, but from the vulnerability of trying and potentially failing. By accepting limitation as reality, she never had to risk finding out whether she actually was capable of overcoming those obstacles. The Limitation Doctrine is particularly insidious because it incorporates genuine obstacles into a narrative of impossibility. Yes, systemic barriers exist. Yes, some people have advantages others don't. Yes, not everyone can achieve everything they might want. But the leap from "this will be challenging and might not succeed" to "this is impossible for someone like me" is where limitation becomes belief rather than assessment. Dismantling this belief requires distinguishing between acknowledging challenges and accepting defeat. The test is whether your realistic assessment leads to strategic problem-solving or resignation. Realism identifies obstacles and then asks, given these constraints, what approaches might work? Who has navigated similar challenges? What would I need to learn or do differently? The practical technique involves constraint reframing. Take one area where you've accepted limitation as reality. Write down all the reasons why change is impossible in that area. Then, for each reason, ask, is this actually preventing change or making change more difficult? If someone else faced these same obstacles, what might they try? Most people discover that their realistic assessment includes both genuine challenges and internalized assumptions disguised as facts. Integration, the belief audit system. Understanding these 5 dangerous beliefs is valuable, but transformation requires systematic integration. Most people hold multiple limiting beliefs simultaneously, each reinforcing the others to create a comprehensive architecture of impossibility. The first step in integration is conducting what we call a belief audit, a structured process for identifying which of these beliefs operate in your life and how they interact. Over the next week, track moments when you feel stuck, resistant, or convinced something isn't possible for you. For each moment, ask, which belief is operating here? Is this the Permanence Doctrine convincing me I can't change? The Safety Doctrine disguised as caution? The Worthiness Doctrine making me feel I don't deserve this? The Comparison Doctrine showing me how others are ahead? The Limitation Doctrine explaining why this isn't possible for someone like me? Most people discover patterns. Perhaps the Permanence Doctrine dominates in career contexts while the Worthiness Doctrine operates in relationships. Or maybe the Safety Doctrine prevents you from taking risks while the Comparison Doctrine explains why others' success proves your inadequacy. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward dismantling them. The second integration practice is belief testing. For each limiting belief you've identified, design small experiments that test whether the belief is actually true. If you believe you can't learn new skills, permanence, commit to 20 hours of deliberate practice in something you've written off as beyond your capabilities. If you believe pursuing opportunities is too risky, take one calculated risk with clearly defined boundaries. If you believe you don't deserve success, worthiness, practice accepting one positive experience daily without immediately discounting it. Document the results objectively. What actually happened versus what your belief predicted would happen. This evidence becomes the foundation for new, more accurate beliefs about yourself and what's possible. The third integration technique is belief interruption. Limiting beliefs operate most effectively when they're automatic and invisible. The moment you recognize a limiting belief in action, you create the possibility of choosing differently. Practice catching yourself mid-thought when a limiting belief activates. Oh, there's the Safety Doctrine telling me this is too risky. Or, that's the Comparison Doctrine suggesting their success means my failure. This interruption doesn't require you to immediately replace the limiting belief with a positive one. That often feels forced and inauthentic. Instead, it creates a pause where you can ask, is this belief helping me or limiting me right now? What would I do if I didn't believe this? The fourth integration practice is community reality testing. Limiting beliefs thrive in isolation, where there's no external perspective to challenge your internal narrative. Find at least one person who understands this framework and commit to regular check-ins where you articulate the beliefs you're wrestling with, and they provide objective feedback about whether your assessment matches observable reality. Be aware of critical pitfalls. The most common is using this framework to replace limiting beliefs with equally unrealistic positive beliefs. The goal isn't to convince yourself you can do anything without effort or constraints. It's to distinguish between genuine limitations, which exist, and communicate objectively what's possible. Should inform strategy, and belief-based limitations, which masquerade as truth but actually prevent you from discovering what you're capable of. Another pitfall is using this work as another form of self-criticism. If you identify limiting beliefs operating in your life, that's not evidence you're broken or doing something wrong. It's evidence you're human. These beliefs develop as protective mechanisms, often in response to real pain or real obstacles. Recognizing them isn't about judgment. It's about updating strategies that once served you but now limit you. With these integration practices established, you're ready to approach life with what psychologists call growth orientation. Not naive optimism, but genuine curiosity about what becomes possible when you stop accepting limiting beliefs as truth. The return to possibility. Remember Robert, the mathematician we met at the beginning? Dr. Ellis followed his progress for 12 years after their work together. Robert not only secured the research fellowship he initially believed was impossible, he went on to make significant contributions to his field, published groundbreaking work, and mentored dozens of students who described him as unusually encouraging and supportive of their potential. But when Ellis asked Robert years later what had changed, his answer was revealing. "It wasn't that I suddenly believed I could do anything," Robert explained. "It was that I stopped believing my limitations were facts. Once I recognized that most of my constraints were beliefs I had internalized rather than truths about reality, I became curious. What is actually true? What am I actually capable of? What becomes possible if I test these beliefs instead of accepting them?" This is what awaits you on the other side of limiting beliefs. Not certainty of success, not freedom from challenges or setbacks, not a magical transformation where everything becomes easy. What awaits you is something more valuable: genuine freedom to discover what you're actually capable of, rather than living within the boundaries of what you've assumed is possible. The 5 beliefs we've explored: permanence, safety, worthiness, comparison, and limitation operate like invisible architecture, structuring what feels possible in your life. Most people live their entire lives inside these structures, never recognizing their constructions rather than reality itself. They make decisions based on beliefs they never chose, pursue goals limited by assumptions they never questioned, and accept constraints that exist in their minds rather than the world. Breaking free doesn't require you to become someone else. It requires you to stop being someone you never truly were, the person these limiting beliefs convinced you that you are. Your journey from belief-limited to possibility-oriented isn't just personal transformation. It's a form of rebellion against the invisible forces that constrain human potential. Every belief you test and update makes it easier for others to question their own limitations. Every risk you take while operating under the Safety Doctrine challenges the narrative that caution equals wisdom. Every success you allow yourself to enjoy despite the Worthiness Doctrine creates evidence that deserving isn't something you earn, it's something you recognize. The path isn't easy, but it leads somewhere that most people never reach: the genuine freedom to pursue what matters to you, limited only by real constraints rather than internalized beliefs. The freedom to discover that many of the things you believed were impossible for someone like you were only impossible because you believed they were. You are not permanently limited. Growth is not fundamentally dangerous. You do not need to earn your worth. Other success does not determine your value. Your constraints do not define your possibilities. These aren't affirmations to repeat, they're hypotheses to test. And in that testing, you may discover something remarkable. The person you could become was never actually impossible. That person was simply waiting on the other side of beliefs you mistook for truth. The audit begins now. The testing starts today. Your transformation isn't coming, it's already here, waiting for you to recognize that the limitations you've accepted were never as real as you believed.